Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to continue having a look at the HSC option Improving Performance, and we're going to have a look at the syllabus content Skill Training. And so when we have a look at where this comes from, we're still looking at the focus question, how do athletes train for improved performance? Unlike strength training, aerobic training, and anaerobic and flexibility training, skill training is something that we haven't seen individually yet within the HSC syllabus. So we would have seen elements of skill training in Core 2 when we look at training for tactics, but this is actually something that we need to add value to. So we're going to have a look at skills training in relation to drills practice, modified and small-sided games, and games for specific outcomes. So for example, decision-making or tactical awareness. And so when we look at this concept of skill training, there's three key areas that you need to make reference to. And the first area is drills practice, and then modified and small-sided games, and games for specific outcomes. And the coaches and sports practitioners will use different types of these three skill trainings to maintain motivation, to improve technique, and to improve tactics and decision-making for athletes when under pressure. So we start by having a look at drill training. Now, you might often hear a coach say, oh, we're going to do some drills now. Now, drills are useful to improving technique and efficiency of skills that an athlete can perform. And it also provides opportunities for coaches to give feedback to that athlete. So when we look at the concept between drill and skills usually focus on a very small and identified thing that needs to happen. So for example, if you're looking at a netballer, the skill of a shoulder pass is obviously something very specific to practice, but then a drill training might incorporate more than one skill. So for example, a drill might involve an athlete using shoulder passes and passing that shoulder pass to someone who's moving at the same time as opposed to a stationary person, or someone who's changing direction, or someone who has a defence player in front of them. And so when looking at drills and organising drills for training sessions, coaches need to consider drills that target strengths and weaknesses of play. So it's important to provide some good feedback and to instill confidence with athletes. And so that's why it's good to focus on both the strengths and weaknesses of the athletes when developing drills. It's also really important that when you do use drills, to keep instruction to a minimum. You don't want to bore the athletes with the instructions and then forget about what the purpose of the drill is. And you also want to use a variety of drills. So obviously, try to use a variety across the whole session, but also from training session to training session, you don't want to continually repeat the same drills. You need to look at making sure that they are in short duration. A drill shouldn't go for, more than 15 minutes because you don't want to take up a whole section of that training session time on one drill. Where you can sort of debate this is that if you make changes to this drill to increase the difficulty, obviously changing that drill a little bit is going to maintain engagement and obviously further develop the athlete's skills as well. It's important not to increase the difficulty until the athletes have actually succeeded with the drill and they're executing technique well. So when we have a look at drill training, there's usually sort of a procedure that coaches follow, and this is in relation to that concept of changing things up, progressively rather than making something really difficult straight away. And so usually a drill begins with sort of an offensive base, so it's an attacking or it's one or two players rather than having two teams. And then the coach may introduce a passive defence, so a defence player that's in there that's just sort of in there taking up space but not actually being too active, which then might move into a small-sided game where that defence actually becomes a little bit more active. And some of the rules of the game, so for example the netball game, might be put into play. So obviously no obstruction, no stepping, that sort of thing, no contact. And then what might happen is that the coach then progresses that fully to implement those drills and the skills that they've learnt into a full-sized game. Now, sometimes the coach may, at certain stages of the drill, introduce targets or goals to try and engage the athletes further, but also to sort of make them a little bit competitive and try to increase their enjoyment of the activity, especially for young athletes. And this might be a concept of trying to get a certain amount of points to be scored or a number of intercepts. And the other really good thing about this is that it allows the coach to monitor the progress. So is this drill actually increasing the athlete's performance, or is it just hindering, or is it sort of plateauing? Do I need to change it up? So once an athlete reaches that goal, that's probably when the coach needs to make an adjustment to the drill or to move on to another drill. So similar to drills, but very different in the same way, are modified and small-sided games. And these games are an effective way for coaches to develop sport-specific skills and adaptations for athletes. And because often we don't want to play a full-size game because that can exhaust athletes. And also sometimes if an athlete is struggling with skill or technique, can provide difficulty if we're using a full-size field, especially for younger athletes. And so the use of modified and small-sided games, when we talk about small-sided, we talk about maybe 2 or 3 players on a team instead of 7 to 10 players on a team, allow athletes to engage themselves in a similar environment to what the full-size game might have, but allows them to also focus on specific things such as technique and looking at their skills and also their tactical play. And because of this small-sided nature, it increases athletes' communication because they can communicate in quite a close vicinity and obviously therefore increasing their teamwork. Coaches will often modify the rules to adapt the number of players and the space. So it's really important that when you are implementing these sort of games within your training program, that you modify the rules. And sometimes that might mean that it's a rule that's different to the game. You don't want to implement rules that are too different to the actual game. So, for example, if it was netball, you want to maintain the integrity in saying that an athlete can't step once they have the ball. If they were modified or junior players, you might say, oh, you can shuffle because that's obviously a junior netter rule. And so you need to make sure that whilst you might adapt the rules around the number of players or space, you need to make sure that you still maintain the specific rules to the sport as well. Now, the advantage of these modified and small-sided games is that they also allow for transition of rules, which decreases difficulty of some of the rules or skills. So, for example, as I said before, with netball, you can't step or you only have 3 seconds. If they're juniors or beginning players, there might be some lenience with that, in that you might say, okay, I'll happily let you take, to shuffle on the spot, or to start with, there's no time limits, because we're really focusing on this aspect of trying to come in front of a player. And then as they progress and develop that skill within that modified game or the small-sided game, you would then implement the original rule back in. And finally, we have a look at games for specific outcomes. Now, these might be modified or small-sided games, but coaches implement these games to increase technical awareness and decision-making and fitness. And so, a coach or a team might watch a video of how they played against the team previously that they might be playing on the weekend again, and have a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of their opposition, and then realise, okay, we need to come up with a way to counteract that. And so this way it allows them to simulate real life scenarios. This could go from being, making their athletes exhausted, making them do, say, a 10-minute run, and then going and doing a drill, because it's saying you need to be able to execute, shooting a basketball shot while you're fatigued. This is simulating what it might be like towards the back end of a quarter or at the game. It could also be that a coach might say, well, we're going to play 5 players against 3 players, because at some stage in a game we may lose a player due to injury or foul play. And so the advantage of these games is that they're player focused with little coach involvement, because the whole idea is to develop the players' decision-making skills and their own tactical awareness. And that's why it's really important for the environment to be positive, where athletes are allowed to make mistakes. Obviously, if we make these mistakes in training, hopefully they learn from that and implement correct ways to play in the actual game. And when you look at reflection of these mistakes, generally coaches should try to do this through questioning, And then that way, rather than telling, that way it allows the athlete to think about their growth and their development and the thought processes behind their movements of play which they executed during the game.